Ash fell like patient snow upon the broken city. It settled on shattered lintels, on bleached stone, on the black tongues of smoke clawing out of narrow streets and fishes' alleys, until even the brightest banners were the color of bones left in a riverbed. Bells had rung and the ringing had died, and still the burning went on. A red tide that swept and curled and hissed. The dragon's voice had dwindled to a distant, intermittent roar, like a storm turning over in another valley, and the cries of men and women stitched the silence left behind. Arya moved through it all as a shadow threading through smoke. Her throat tasted of copper and ash. Her eyes wept from the sting. Her boots tapped on the flagstones slick with dust. She had turned when the man who was more stone than flesh told her to turn. Go, girl, live. And for a time she had obeyed, because what he said had sounded like truth in the brittle halls of her heart. But turning away did not unmake a name or unlearn a list whispered in the dark over the crackle of old pinewood fires. In some rooms of herself, the candles never blew out. In those rooms, Cersei Lannister sat on a throne of iron blades, smiling a razor's smile. So Arya climbed again, against the flow of bodies surging away. The heat grew worse the higher she went, as if she were ascending into a furnace. Broken carvings peered like blinded saints from the walls, gazing on the ruin below. She slipped between stumbling soldiers and a mother heavy with child, found a side stair when a gallery fell, ducked beneath a pendulous beam that breathed embers. The Red Keep rose ahead, its lines blurred in the heat, its pale stones crying, its face streaked with soot. She had almost reached the courtyard behind the keep when she heard the sea, a hoarse whisper beneath the high thunder. Wind blew up from the water, with salt and burnt tar and the smell of ruptured casks. There was a long stair there, hidden behind a half-collapsed colonnade, leading down to the shingle and the snarl of ruined ships. Sound traveled along it like breath through a reed. A voice cursing, a voice laughing, steel on stone. She went down. Halfway, she paused and pressed herself into the shadow of an arch below. On a quicksand of smashed timber and torn netting, two figures reeled together. One wore black leather and a bell-trimmed sash, his grin red with blood. The other moved like a man forcing himself through his own death, his sword arm clumsy, his left arm agleam. The bells on the first man's sash jingled madly with every lunging step. The sea hissed against the pebbles. Arya watched them circle, break, clash, circle again. She watched the one with the golden hand take a wound and slump and lurch back to his feet. Watched him use the rocks to steady himself in that stubborn, sorrowing way some men had when their bodies betrayed them. Euron Greyjoy laughed until he choked on it, and the last laugh ran away into the wind. The other man stood with his sword lowered and the sword red. His hair was matted to his forehead. His fine leathers were tar-dark and shredded. The gold at his wrist caught a stray shaft of sunlight and threw it back as if it were a signal to someone who had no eyes to see. He turned a little as if following a scent, and his face came up from shadow. Arya knew him. There had been a boy like him standing among the banners at Winterfell once upon a snow-choked morning. The squire of a king from the south, a bright and cruel-eyed boy beside a woman like a green-flamed candle. But the man before her was older than that memory and older too than he had any right to be. Lines ironed the corners of his mouth. The beard could not decide if it would hide him or betray him. His eyes were pale and hungry, looking past the stones, past the smoke, straining toward a tower. He moved as if he had counted his pains and found no profit in them, yet kept walking with the weight in his shoulders because he had no other trade left. He took 3 steps and almost fell. His right hand caught the rock. The golden one slid on the salt scum, clinked, scraped. He swore and shoved the stump against his leather to fix the gauntlet tighter. He was leaving so much of himself behind as he climbed that he seemed not to notice he had left a trail at all. Arya came out of the shadow when he was almost upon her. He jerked, startled, then checked and found stillness the way a trained horse finds the bit. For a heartbeat his right hand flew for the sword he had no strength to lift again. Then his mouth twisted into something like a smile, and he regarded her with a soldier's measuring look. "You," he said softly. "Me," Arya said. In that single syllable there were many winters, many pools of reflection, a list of names, 100 miles of roads walked in the dark. The man's nostrils flared. Some wary memory moved through his gaze, and then a flash of something like resignation softened it. "If you're here to stop me," he said, "you're too late. I'm already slow." Arya looked at the sword in his hand, at the blood drying in a silk of rust along its fuller. She looked at the golden hand. "Is she in the keep?" she asked. "If she's not, then there's no world," he said. "The world is where she is." He said it peerless, matter of fact. Not pride, not plea, not boast, merely a statement about a thing as ordinary as a cup or a rainstorm. "This is the world, and this is where it lies." He pushed himself upright and made to pass her. She stepped into him and set her palm flat against his chest, just above the ragged leather seam. "You can barely stand," she said. "I've stood in worse places," he said, "for worse ends. You won't reach her before the stones do." "I don't need to reach her before the stones," he said. "I need to reach her at all." The wind sighed, bringing up to them scraps of sound from the city above. He was close enough that she could see where the salt had dried on his jaw, where a blade had glanced off his ribs, where the woman who had wept in the godswood had put her hands on him and turned away again, leaving warmth behind that had become an ache. Close enough to see that he had left the oaths of a lifelong man lying in a snowdrift like a broken sword and then picked them up again, and the picking had cut both hands. "Do you know me?" Arya asked. He studied her in that same tired, exact way, and answered without guile. "I know you," he said. "You were smaller. You had a wooden sword and rage. Do you know my list?" "I know my brother made a list," he said dryly.
Ale, sausages, whores.
"I suppose yours is shorter and sharper." She did not smile. There were days when the list had been a raft and days when it had been an anchor, and often it had been both. Today it was neither. Today it was a door she could open or close. "My queen," she said, and did not say which queen. "Your sister, your lover." The words were not knives. They were just a description of a pattern woven until it could not be picked apart. He flinched only at one of them, and not the one she expected. "Sister," he said, as though trying to remember what that word was supposed to taste like. He tried to move past her again. She let him try for 2 steps, then took his sword away. It was an easy thing. He was too slow and too tired. She struck his wrist with 2 fingers in a way a man whose face she had never worn had taught her, and the blade dropped, and she caught it with an economy that surprised even herself. The point shivered in the stones. He looked down at his empty hand with bemused detachment. "Don't," he said quietly. The sea breathed. A gull drifted on the hot air, its wings taking the light like hammered tin. He watched it as if it had the courtesy to spare him her gaze. "I should have died 100 times earlier," he said. "I should have died on the ridge above the whispering wood. I should have died under a bear bigger than my sins. I should have died when the sept went up. But I didn't. I've been a coward for days on end, and then a fool for weeks to pay for it." He rolled the stump in the golden glove and the metal chimed softly. "Don't be merciful to me." Arya had no mercy to spare or spend. She had a choice to make, and there was only ever one road in front of her, although sometimes it forked and each fork had a different name carved on it. She stepped forward into him and placed her forearm against his throat just enough to feel the pulse jump beneath skin. That small hot hammer that meant there was still choice in him, too. She saw the anger in him then, the last stubborn ember, and beneath it the weariness that had its own fierce dignity. "I don't care about you," she said. "I care about her." "I know," he said. "Everyone does. Perhaps I hate you a little for what you did to a boy who didn't deserve it," she added, because truth had a weight she liked to keep with her. "But you paid for that 1,000 ways. Perhaps I hate you because you ran back to her when you could have run from her. Perhaps I hate you because you love her, and it will be cleaner if someone who doesn't love her ends it." He made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been the last hinge of pride swinging shut. "Cleaner," he said. "You learned that where you learned the other things?" "I learned that in a kitchen," she said, "and in a hall." He raised his chin a little, the way a man might when he sees the sword coming and chooses to look at the light instead of the blade. He looked past her again, toward the place where the keep shouldered the sky. "Will you tell her?" he began, and stopped and started again.
No.
"Don't. There's no story to tell that she doesn't already know. Just, I have no words for her," Arya said. "Only one thing. That's what she'll deserve," he said. They stood very close then. The world's noises crowded in. The hiss of retreating waves, a muffled boom far above, the whine of a shutter twisting on a single hinge, someone crying 3 streets away, a long, soft animal sound that did not end. The man's eyes found hers and held. They were the faded blue of a winter sky after burning. She thought of a weirwood's red mouth and of a god who saw everything and judged nothing. "Do it," he said. She did. She did it quick, as she had been taught. She left no more marks than the ones the rocks and the waves had given him. Afterwards, she held his head against her shoulder until the last tension went out of his neck and his weight became the ordinary weight of a body. She lay him down in the lee of a toppled boat, its ribs black as a comb, and knelt for a moment and did not pray. She had no prayers. The gods had heard all of them, and she had none left to offer. The wind tore at a torn pennant. The dragon roared again, and a new warm rain began to fall. Ash and fine cinders that clung to the lashes and made a gray wash of the world. Arya wiped the salt from her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at the man's face, at the rumpled hair and the rough beard and the mouth that had last kissed the woman she meant to kill. In the house of black and white, they had given names to what she felt next. It was not grief or pity or triumph. It was craft. She wedged her feet against the rocks and set the small knife where it needed to go. Later, she washed what needed washing in the bitter water, and laid what should be laid away in a canvas bag with its drawstring pulled tight. She wiped her own face with the linen until the blood of another man was no more than a taste she would carry in her teeth for an hour, like a seed. When she turned back to the stairs, the weight of the golden hand surprised her. It was denser than the rest of him had been. She strapped it at her belt and felt it bang against her thigh as she climbed. It was the weight of a deed, of a secret. It was heavy as a word not yet spoken. She climbed into the burning. The lower doors of the keep gaped like a mouth whose lips had peeled back. Inside, the air was still and hotter. In the long corridor where tapestries had once shushed the footsteps of courtiers, there were only sharp holes and lengths of black twine hung with cinders. Her own steps sounded too loud. Twice she pulled into a doorway and stood long enough to feel the stone cool her ribs, the only cool thing left in the world, while a squad of men went past in a trot. Their faces had that blank look soldiers' faces get when the orders make no more sense and you follow them anyway because you have soldiers' legs. She had no desire to kill them. She had one desire, and it was not of a kind that needed witnesses. She found a place where the floor had split and fallen away into dark. The break had made a new path along the sides, narrower than a catwalk. It would have frightened another girl once, though perhaps not even then. She put her palms against the wall and went sideways along it, feeling grit under her fingertips. Beyond the crack, she could see the lower vaults where scrolls had been kept, where casks of wine had rolled to cool. Fire moved through those vaults like a beast that did not know it had teeth. Where it touched barrels, they popped their hoops and sighed out gasps of scent that belonged to a season that would never come again. She found the map room's door and the room beyond and the painting on the floor that had once been the world. It was no longer any world at all. The green spray of the reach, the slender fingers of the fingers, the course of the trident, all were smoked into one gray smudge. A woman stood at the far end, small against a window that had been all view and was now a mouthful of hot air. A man in a black robe clucked at her shoulder like a nervous hen. The taller one, hooded in iron, no, not iron, skin and something worse, stood a step behind with stillness that was beyond the stillness of statues. Cersei Lannister had taken off her crown. It lay forgotten on the edge of the painted world like a toy put down truthfully for the first time. Her hair was longer than Arya had last seen it, and singed at the ends. Her gown had been white once and was now a brownish, ashy color like bread left long in the oven. She had one hand pressed low on her belly, as if steadying the quiet thing growing within as the castle shifted beneath her. She turned when Arya entered. The queen's face did not change in any dramatic way. It did not fall into tears or harden into marble. It relaxed, as if pain that had knotted it had unwound a degree. She looked at Arya and did not see her at all. "Jaime," she said, and it was the breath a drowning person makes when their head breaks the surface and they find the air still has taste. Arya let the woman come to her. A good face is a key slipped into a lock. Turns and it opens what it opens. This face opened not just the door of the room but the doors behind Cersei's eyes. The queen crossed the floor at a pace between a walk and a stumble and put both hands on Arya's shoulders. The weight was appalling and immediate and human, and Arya, careful as she had ever been, let herself take it. "I thought," Cersei said, and the word broke into many smaller ones that scattered and were no longer words at all. She glanced once at the black-robed man, whose lips twitched in calculation, and did not look at the large silence behind him. We need to go now. The passages are broken," Arya said, and the voice that came out of her was not hers. It had a scrape of wine in it, and something warm and self-mocking, and weariness layered like bandage on bandage. It was strange to hear it and to feel the leap of trust it made in the woman in front of her. When men heard their names, they turned toward them. When women heard the voices of the men they loved, they forgave terrible things. "We'll find another," Cersei said. Her hands slid from Arya's shoulders down the leather, past the buckles, to the golden hand strapped there. Her fingertips hovered above it a moment, and she touched the metal the way you touch a relic that has survived a fire. "You're hurt," she murmured. "You're always hurt." The black-robed man, Qyburn, the old whisper said, a carrion crow made up to dine with kings, stepped forward. His brow shone with sweat that had not been earned by exertion. He peered at Arya like a man peering into a beaker where a reaction is almost complete. "We must go at once, Your Grace. There are reports." "Quiet," Cersei said, and her voice had that iron bell of command again, even with ash caked in the corners of her mouth. "My brother will lead me." "Your brother," Arya thought, with a cold indifference that was nearly curiosity. How quickly the locks turned, how quickly rooms opened where war had raged. The tall one moved then, as if awakened by the motion in the room. He, the monster, the mountain unraveled and rewoven. His eyes 2 stones sunk in meat, and in that moment there came up the rumble of footsteps on the stairs outside, and another figure stepped into the doorway, wide and battered and stinking of smoke and old sorrow. He did not look at Cersei and did not look at Arya. He looked only at the thing he had come to kill, and in his gaze there was an endless winter's patience. "Go," Sandor Clegane rasped at Arya without seeing her. It was not Arya that he saw to warn. It was the man whose face she wore, whose life had become the currency for this scene. The name that had once been on her list. She did not speak. She moved before any of them could, in that half-world between decision and act where her body had always lived. She took Cersei's hand, warm, too warm, and turned, and the queen came with her willingly, as she had once followed a lion's standard through cheering crowds. Qyburn fluttered behind like a pale moth. The mountain stepped in the way of the hound, or the hound stepped in the way of the mountain, and the world contracted behind Arya. To a clash of iron on stone and a heavy, intimate breaking sound as something soft met something as indifferent as a gatepost. She did not look back. That story belonged to men who had washed in blood and found it did not cleanse. She led Cersei into a narrow stair and down, further down, into the bowels where the great skulls had once watched princes court their deaths. The stones sweated heat down here. The air was close and tasted of old smoke and oiled leather. The ground underfoot shook now and then like a dog coming out of water. Twice, dust rattled in a sheet from the ceiling and a fine rain of grit hissed onto their hair. Qyburn muttered topography to himself, old maps half remembered. He tried to take the lead and Arya let him for the span of 3 breaths, and then saw a shadow at the corner of an arch and put an elbow into his sternum so gently, he could later tell himself he had only stumbled. At the foot of a long run of stairs, The corridor widened into a low chamber with a cracked barrel vault and black marks on the walls like the shadows of torches that had gone out long ago. There was a doorway here, blocked with fallen stone, and another, narrower, where a trickle of light like ooze seeped through. Outside it, the courtyard above had become a well of red glare. "We can go no further," Qyburn panted. "We must try another way." "There is no other way," Cersei said. She turned, and in the severe light her face was made of clean lines and bones and a set of the mouth that was almost serene. "Is there, Jaime?" "No," Arya said. The word weighed something. She felt the weight of it in the throbbing stone, in the low thunder like someone moving furniture in a room overhead. She felt it in herself in the 2 or 3 small chambers that had not burned. The one where her father sat cleaning a blade with a rag and not looking at her. The one where a red woman whispered to her about eyes and darkness. The one where a many-faced god asked for a price and she gave it. Cersei stepped to her, no, stepped to him, and laid her palm on Arya's cheek. The queen's palm was hot and smelled faintly of rose oil and smoke. Her eyes had the color of old green leaves when the light goes through them. She searched Arya's face the way a person searches the sky for a sign, some pattern that tells them which way the wind will go. "In the end," she said, and her voice was very soft, "it's always us." Arya had expected iron here, or honey over iron. She found neither. She found the plainest sentence in the world, and within it something like the echo of a girl in a tower with a witch's words trapped under her tongue. A girl whose father had taught her that love was a debt that must be paid and had shown her very clearly how to pay it. She saw the girl in the woman, and it did not make her want to spare her. It made her want to stop lying to her. "Do you remember the Woods Witch?" Arya asked, not knowing until the words were out that she would ask it. Cersei flinched very faintly, as if someone had tapped a glass. "Children's tales," she said. "Children grow," Arya said. For a heartbeat, the look in Cersei's eyes was absolute hatred, pure and bladed. A thing that could split oak. It passed as quickly as it came, because the castle shuddered and a run of stones slid like marbles in a jar, and the light died almost completely for an instant. When it came back, her face was composed again. "I don't care about witches," she said, and Arya thought that was the truest thing she had heard this woman say. "I care about our child." Her hand went to her belly again, and her mouth softened. It did not make her harmless. It made her human. Arya found that she could hold both truths inside herself without breaking. The woman as a monster and the woman as a mother, because she had learned to keep several lives in the same small space. "I know," Arya said, and stepped in. Qyburn made a noise, a small bureaucrat's protest. The stones made a larger one. Cersei blinked and looked down between them, as if surprised to find she was this close to the body that had brought her so many kingdoms and lost them all. She lifted her chin so their foreheads almost touched. "You'll take me out," she said. "You always have." "Yes," Arya said. "I'll take you out." She slid her right hand to the back of Cersei's neck, not rough, the way you hold the nape of a nervous horse. She raised her left, the golden one, and set it against the front of the queen's throat, where the skin was pale beneath the ash and the veins were a blue thread. The metal was cool. Cersei's mouth opened, not to protest, but because she had understood something she had never permitted herself even to imagine. Not that she would die, which everyone understands, but that she would die without witnesses who loved her enough to tell the story later the way she wanted it told. For an instant, a single word lived in Cersei's eyes. Brother. Arya drew her in closer, so their faces nearly touched. She could smell the rose oil. She could see herself reflected tiny in the queen's pupils, a little dark figure in the blazing hall of those eyes. In the reflection, she was not Jaime. She was no one. She was herself. The golden hand tightened. In the books of priests there are deaths described in the language of virtues: fortitude, humility, patience. In kitchens, death is described with work verbs: carve, wash, press, turn. This death was a pressing and a turning. It was the ending of something that had occupied too much of the map for too long. The queen fought in small, efficient motions. No flailing, no theater. Dignity stripped to its bone. Her fingertips scrabbled at Arya's wrist. Her heel scraped on ash. A brittle crack sounded somewhere in the stone above them like a coin being snapped. When it was over, her lashes lay half down like a girl feigning sleep and then forgetting to rise. Qyburn's mouth had fallen open. He had not moved, perhaps understanding that here is always a last calculation, and sometimes it is not the one you think it will be. He took a half-step backward, as though to seek some corridor that would return him to the world that had rules. Arya turned her head to look at him, and he froze, because the face that looked at him was a man's he had served and the look in the eyes was not. Your Grace, he stammered, and stopped, because the title had come too late and with the wrong shape. You may go, Arya said in Jaime's voice. The generosity of that surprised her even as it issued from her mouth. It was not mercy. It was indifference. He did not go. He stood and shook and opened and closed his hands as if expecting to find a quill in them. He had none. He had only the memory of cleverness. The mountain above them gave another of its long shudders. Dust came down in a slow veil that turned them all old. Arya set the queen's body very carefully on the stones, ladylike even in death, because that small courtesy cost her nothing, and because lately she had learned that sometimes such courtesies weighed more than all the cruelty men count. She drew 2 fingers down across those green eyes they had made into flags and closed them. Then she unstrapped the golden hand from her belt and buckled it onto the glove, settling it into the notch where metal met stump. She left the room by a different door than the one they had entered. Qyburn did not follow. He might have stayed to adapt to this new kingdom, but the stones had no place for him. Far up the corridor behind her, there came a broken cry and the kind of silence that is not quiet but a change in pressure when one vast heaviness stops. She thought of the big man who had told her to turn back and wondered if he had found the end he had chosen. Men like him deserved chosen endings, even if they were made of ruin. She went into passages that had never had names. The castle trembled. She took turns that made no sense and then made sense to her feet. She took off the man's face when she could, when she was alone, because the weight of it was not physical and because she wanted the air against her skin. She laid it against her chest beneath her jerkin like a talisman and then stuffed it into the sack again because that was no thing to make a talisman of. There was blood on her fingers, and she wiped them on her thighs and left 5 pointed stars there encrusted brown. Once, she found a girl curled against a cask, eyes wild white in a soot-black face. The girl held a bundle that might have been a child or might have been clothes. Arya crouched. The corridor shook, and both of them put a palm on the wall and waited. When it stilled, they blinked at each other. The girl did not speak. Arya put out her hand and the girl did not take it. She nodded and moved on without being offended. It struck her that she had become the kind of creature others survived by not trusting. Her thoughts returned, unbidden, to the last expression on Cersei's face before the eyes had closed. Brother, did Arya believe that? Did the woman? Did the gods? The gods, if they bothered with women's stories, would see this neatness and approve, or at least be amused. A little brother had done it. A little sister inside a little brother's face. A prophecy turned at an angle like a mirror turned to catch the light in a different way. She climbed until climbing became wading, and wading became crawling. She crawled across a hall where the ceiling hung like a torn sail. She crawled beneath a table where a lord had probably made a toast one evening when the windows were open and nothing burned. She stood at last in a doorway and looked at the sun trying to pierce the haze, and walked into it. Outside, the city lay like a long breath held too long. She saw men kneeling, hands raised. She saw women running with children on both hips. She saw a man in bright armor with a pale standard walking down a road as if he were carrying a door on his shoulder rather than a flag. She saw the dragon sear a line along a row of houses and the roofs leap up like a field of wolves startled from sleep. She saw no queen in white on a balcony, no queen in green, only the idea of queens dissolving like salt. She washed at a fountain whose basin was cracked but not yet empty. The water ran black at first and then gray. She watched her face come back to her in the shifting surface and did not recognize it for a second. She touched her lower lip, found a cut there she had not felt happen, and pressed until it stung. It rooted her. A boy came tearing past with a loaf under his arm, someone shouting after him. And she saw, absurdly, two brown kittens tangled together under the lip of the fountain, too frightened to move, their ears flat. She reached and lifted them one by one and set them in the shadow of a flower box where the ivy had not yet burned. She had learned that sometimes saving two small useless things could keep you from breaking clean in the middle. The heat eased as the afternoon wore toward dusk. The dragon's roaring grew more intermittent still. Corpses were being arranged in lines that no one would ever have time to catalog. She walked among soldiers whose faces were blank with exhaustion, and among men whose hands shook not at what they had done but at what they had been ordered to allow. A woman banged pots together in a doorway, as if noise could make a ward. A man hunched and sang to himself without tune. It was no more and no less than what a sack city always was. Near the gate where the carts had once entered with citron and pepper and fat grapes on the vine, a man with a short beard and sad eyes was arguing with another about water. When Arya lifted her head, their voices grew thin and blew away like silk threads. She had thought to go to the river and let it pull the heat out of her bones, or perhaps to the holding where the northern men gathered into their own shape again. Instead, she turned her steps toward a quiet she knew she would not find in any alley. Tyrion Lannister crouched among the timbers at the 4th hour of that evening. He had taken a torch and a hope into the catacombs like a child with a tin sword, and the hope had gone out long before the torch. The small man sat on a stone with the torch end planted between his boots and his head in his hand, and the light made his eyes look like wet coins. He had been crying in a controlled, irritated way, the way a man cries when he detests this weakness in his body but cannot direct it to stop. He did not immediately register Arya's approach. His mind was busy with counting stones and telling them to call themselves names other than stones. She did not speak to him at first. She sat with her back against the other side of the passage and let the heat seep through them. The torch trembled. Far away some stones thought of falling and did. He lifted his head at last and looked at her. "You're not tall enough to be anyone I'm angry with," he said. "I suppose I should be grateful for that." "Be grateful that you're alive," Arya said. "I am," he said very simply. "It's just an odd feeling to be grateful for the wrong thing." He stood then and looked toward the end of the corridor where the rubble lay deepest, and she saw in the way his mouth moved that he was speaking to two ghosts. He took one step toward the pile, then another, and then stopped as if he had struck a glass door. "Don't," Arya said, and he turned toward her. "Don't?" he asked, and in that one softened syllable there was 100 lines of family history, and a child's cornered sarcasm, and a man who had learned to live with jokes like splinters. "You won't change anything by seeing," Arya said. "No," he agreed, "but sometimes seeing is all that's left to do." He stared down at his hands, and for a moment she thought he would put his face in them again and let the crying take him. He did not. He put the torch out gently against the stone instead, and the darkness knotted itself around them. When he spoke again, his voice was in it without effort. "I'm going to have to be very clever very quickly tomorrow," he said. "It will go badly if I fail." "That's true of many tomorrows," Arya said. He laughed a small laugh. "I don't suppose you saw my brother," he said, as casually as he could manage. "I saw him," Arya said. "Ah." The soul of the sound was grief. The shape he gave it was courtesy. Was he? "He was brave," Arya said, and paused, because she had promised herself long ago that she would avoid lies and avoid truth when truth was only cruelty by another name. "He was himself." "That was never simple," Tyrion said. "Thank you." He did not ask anything else. He was not a fool. If he guessed anything, he locked it away the way he had learned to lock away the other things he could not change. She thought that in another life, one where tenderness mattered in the telling of a story, she might tell him something truer. She left him to his ghosts and climbed back into a sky that had leached its color. The dragon made one more pass over the city and then was gone. The beating of its wings a slow drum that faded into memory even as it struck. At the far end of the street, men began to cheer with an uncertainty that made the sound tremble. It grew, as all cheers do, not because certainty had arrived, but because there is a comfort in making noise together after an hour of listening to fear. Arya moved through the edges of the gathering until it made no sense to keep moving. She sat on a stoop whose door had been axed wide and rested her forearms on her knees and watched soldiers do what soldiers do after victory. They made themselves look occupied. They sorted their kits, they shared skins, they told each other that this would have happened anyway. She saw 3 of them push one of their fellows back from a cowering woman, and she watched them argue with him not in morality but in logistics. She watched the woman stand and spit and gather her dignity into the tatters of her dress. The world had not been made new. It had been broken in different places. Near midnight a wind came off the bay with enough coolness to remind the skin of what it used to be. Arya drew a long breath and let the chill find the back of her throat. She held it a second and let it out in a thread. When she closed her eyes, she saw a woman's face turning slowly slack beneath a golden palm. She thought of what it meant to take a face from a man and to use it for that. She did not feel stained. She felt concluded. Sleep was not for her. She rose and drifted to the square where the ashes had drifted deeper than elsewhere and found a piece of stone to sit on. A half-burnt wooden horse leaned against a butcher's door. 2 old men argued about a map neither could see anymore. Hours wore and the city settled into the sound that comes after catastrophe. The collective murmur of people surviving. When the thin beginning of dawn paled the east, she went down to the quay again. Boats had not escaped. They lay with their ribs up, their planks sprung. A child sat on a coiled rope and sucked his thumb, wiping it occasionally on his sleeve to remove ash he did not seem to notice. Arya squatted beside him and put a strip of dried meat into his free hand. He looked at it as if it were a riddle and then tucked it under his shirt and kept sucking his thumb. Somewhere a bell rang once, indifferently, as if by accident. She took out the small bag and sat with it in her lap. The string cut a fine groove in the flesh if you pulled it tight. She loosened it and looked inside at what she had no right to keep. What did it make her to have this? What would she be if she chose to empty it into the sea? She sat a long time, weighing nothing that could be weighed. At last she cinched the cord and set the bag back where it had been. A shadow fell across her. She did not start. She was past starting. Jon Snow stood, with his mouth a small line and his eyes that weary, decent gray that never learned how to love a lie. His armor looked like it had been hammered out of last night. He said her name and sat. She looked at him and saw the boy with the long face and the heart too big for his shirt, and the man with the knowledge that every good act is paid for with a worse one, and the leader who did not want to lead and led anyway, and the brother and nothing more. She did not smile and he did not either. They sat with their shoulders near but not touching and listened to the water. "Is it done?" he asked. She thought about the question and decided she could answer it without committing a sin. "Some things are," she said. He nodded. It was not acceptance. It was a record. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with the back of his hand and left a gray smear there. He said nothing about dragons or queens or the way the world had shifted on its hinge. She was grateful. He stood again after a time and put his hand on her head, like a benediction and a brother's clumsy affection, and then went away to do what men do when morning comes and expectations wake with it. 3 days later, rumors had grown like mushrooms in a damp cellar. One had it that Cersei had fled on a ship of jade with a spiced husband at the helm. One had it that she had surrendered on the steps of the Great September, before remembering there was no Great September. One had it that the dragon had carried her away in its claws, mistaking her for mutton on the hoof. One had it that her brother had found her and they had died together beneath a rain of stone, folded into each other like spoons in a drawer. That last rumor dug its taproot deepest. People like stories that make a point even when the point is cruel. When Tyrion went to the place where stones had made a tomb and came back pale and shut his doors and his face for a day, the rumor sprouted buds and leaves and became a fact. In a wine shop, Arya heard a sellsword say in satisfaction that it served the bitch right. In a courtyard, she heard a girl's voice say wonderingly, as if practicing the words, that love is the same as hate if you lean on it hard enough. No one spoke of strangling. No one spoke of a golden hand set against a throat. If Qyburn's cleverness survived long enough to tell a story, it chose not to tell that one. In the evenings, the city tried to be itself. Men hammered, women shook out cloth. A boy practiced with a battered lute and found the same 3 notes and made of them a tune. The dragon hunted far away in the hills where no one could see it. Its absence became part of the quiet. Arya walked until she found places where the smoke had not entered, small pockets of spared air, corners that smelled of thyme or fish or rust instead of burned velum. She slept in different houses each night. No one took notice. She had learned how to cast the shadow of unimportance over herself like a cloak. On the 7th morning, she went to the place where the river flared into the bay and spoke to a man with a boat and a scar along his jaw the shape of a hook. He watched her as men watch the sea, cautiously, pragmatically, hoping it will not decide to become land. She told him she could use oars and a line, and he said that was all anyone needed to do, and named a price that assumed her pockets looked like everyone else's. "I don't want to go to any of your places," she said when he asked. "I want to go to no places at all." "There's always a place," he said. "Only some of them haven't been named yet." She thought about that and felt a tightness ease somewhere inside her. "That's where I mean," she said. He shrugged as if to say that a paying passenger's foolishness was not his affair. He told her he would be ready in 3 days, if the wind came around. She gave him a coin and watched it disappear. She had never cared for coins beyond their use, and she would care even less for them where she meant to go. On her way back through the market that was trying to pretend it hadn't been an abattoir, she passed a stall selling lemons at a price designed to make men laugh. She bought one and bit into it and let the sourness bite back, and a memory uncoiled of a younger queen with a ribbon in her hair walking gardens and planning everything she would be given by the world. The lemon's juice lit the sores in her mouth. She chewed and swallowed and felt very awake. Tyrion found her that afternoon in a lane where char had blackened the lower halves of the walls and left the upper halves the pale rose they had been. He walked with the careful deliberation of a man arranging the contents of a cart that might overturn. His eyes looked older by a year. "I've been told," he said without preamble, "that my brother died a good death. I've been told many things. I've been told more things than any one man needs." "You were always a man who listened," Arya said. "Listening is how small men keep their heads," he said. "Speaking is how we lose them." He paused and looked at her directly. "There are things I could guess if I set my guessing in a particular way," he said carefully. "But I've decided not to. I would prefer a simple story. I think I'm owed one." She considered him and decided he was, in some bent, just world calculus strangers right when they want to comfort themselves. He was headed for her, she said. He would not have stopped. "No," Tyrion said, and turned the word in his mouth like a coin to check for bite marks. "No, he would not. Thank you." He rubbed his beard with his thumb and forefinger, the way a scholar feels whether the vellum is thick enough. "And she?" he asked, and the tiny crack in his voice was not something he seemed ashamed of. "She died quick," Arya said. It was the truth. It was not a kindness, but it did not need to be. He smiled a little wry and broken. "Then there's hope for the rest of us," he said and moved on, his small figure making its way among the piles and piles of normal rubble. She watched him go and felt a weight shift in a way that felt almost like grace. Once she would have taken satisfaction in the pain of someone who shared the name of the woman she had killed. She did not now. The woman was gone. The story she had written for herself had been stopped mid-sentence. The rest of them were left to finish their pages one clumsy line at a time. The man with the boat kept his word about the weather. On the morning the city sky looked as if a painter had washed the smoke off it with a blue rag. Arya walked to the quay with a strip of dried meat and a skin of water, her boots clean enough for a beginning. She wore a cloak the color of fog and carried nothing that would bind her to shore. In her belt pouch a small canvas bag sat with the rest of the small coins and hooks. At the lip of the quay she paused and looked back. The red keep made a jagged line against the morning, humbled and still proud. Somewhere inside it, stones lay where they had fallen, the new order of them as valid as the old. Somewhere beneath, bones lay under broken slabs, ordinary in the way that hurt and love make bones ordinary. She thought, very briefly, of laying the small bag at the edge of the water and opening it and letting the sea take it. She could do it with a single pinch and tug. She could unmake the last proof. She could be a story only she knew. She did not. She stepped into the boat. The wood rocked under her as an animal shifts its weight. The man with the scar nodded at her, and the boy at the bow shoved them off with a pole. The oars bit. The harbor widened. The first swell lifted the ribs beneath her and then set them down again. She let the motion carry her and looked toward the line where the sky lay on the sea like a blade on a whetstone. "What's out there, girl?" the boatman asked in a voice that made no judgments. "Nothing," Arya said, and then, after a moment, "Everything." The gulls followed them a little way and then gave up. The city diminished to its simplest shapes. The wind found their faces and took their hair and blew the last of the ash out of it. She opened her mouth to the salt and breathed. At night, when the stars came out without being filtered through smoke, Arya lay with her hands behind her head and watched them move the way they have always moved, as if the affairs of queens and their dragons were a rumor they had overheard once and decided not to pass along. She did not feel light or heavy. She felt made of the same things as the boat and the rope and the air. She slept without pictures, in dreams that did not know they were dreams. She stood once more in the broken chamber under the keep. Cersei's hand lifted to her throat, to touch the place where the pressure had been, as a woman might touch a phantom ache years after a wound has healed. She looked at Arya, not accusing, not pleading, just looked. "Is this what you are?" She asked conversationally, perhaps the way she had once asked a dressmaker if this was what would be worn next season. "Yes," Arya said, because she was useless at lying to the dead. "And no." The queen nodded as if that made the kind of sense she respected. "I made a world to fit inside my fist," she said. "It kept getting out." "Worlds do that," Arya said. "I should have learned to hold my hand open," Cersei mused, and then smirked at herself, because smirking had been one of the only honest things she had ever done. "No, I would never have done that." She faded then, as dreams do. The morning came up cold and clean. The boat sliced through the roadless sea as if the sea had been made just to allow that small blade. Arya chewed a strip of meat and washed it down with water that tasted of the cask and thought of her father saying a thing he had believed, that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. She had always liked the logic of it. Her father had not known anything about faces, or about how the world sometimes asked you to make the swing while wearing the face of the man who should have. She supposed he would not hold it against her. He had not been a hard man, only a stubbornly good one. She smiled to herself. No triumph, no delight, only the easy curve of a mouth that had made a choice and lived. In her belt pouch, the small bag lay quiet among the coins. She did not need to touch it to know its weight. It was a weight she could carry far and then put down without fanfare, on a shore no one had named yet, under a sky that did not remember fire. Behind her, in a city learning new ways to endure, bards would decide how it had happened. Some would tell you a lioness had died in her den, kissing her mate with dust on her lips while the castle folded them gently into its ribs. Some would say there had been dragons and madness and that one queen had eaten another. A very few would whisper that a younger brother had done what younger brothers have always done, reached up and taken what older siblings thought was theirs by right. None of them would have it entirely wrong. Each of them would have the part he could bear. The sea darkened and lightened. The boat rose and fell. Arya Stark looked west, where men's maps gave up and the great edge of the world went only by the name it had been given when there were no names at all. She did not watch the shore shrink. She watched the line ahead and the door it kept pretending to be. The wind freshened. She stood and took her turn at the oars, her hands sure. When she pulled, it was not out of flight and not toward pursuit. It was simply the motion that put her where she meant to be. She had killed a queen wearing a brother's face. The world had narrowed and then widened again. Her list had grown quiet. The part of her that had learned to be no one laid its head in the lap of the part that was Arya and slept, and the part that was Arya kept watch, steady as a ship's lantern. Long after noon, when the sky had become a clear plain and the swells forgot the harbor's old quarrels, She put a hand unconsciously to her throat and felt the beat there, unremarkable and persistent. She thought of how it had felt to feel another stop beneath the same palm. A golden palm then, and she felt no sickness and no sting of rapture. She felt the calm after work well done. Tiredness that was its own comfort. Far ahead, a bird that did not belong to shore dipped and skimmed along the waves like a thought being tested. Arya shaded her eyes to follow it. It went on west and did not look back.